My wife and I got into an argument and she said, "Do you want me to call my boyfriend?" "Yeah, call him. I want to find out who this guy is." I slammed my coffee mug on the counter. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact, then hit call before I could see the name. She put it on speaker and set it on the kitchen island between us. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice I knew better than my own answered. "Babe, is everything okay?" It was my brother Drew. "Drew, you've been screwing my wife while I was in Afghanistan? Matthew, you're alive?" Drew's voice cracked like he'd seen a ghost. "What do you mean I'm alive? Of course I'm alive." I stared at the phone like it might explain this insanity. "But I went to your funeral. We all did." His voice trailed off into nothing. Laura lunged for the phone and hung up. "What do you mean there was a funeral?" My mind couldn't process what I'd just heard. Laura slid down to the floor sobbing. I'd never seen her like this. Not when her mom died. Not when I'd deployed. Complete breakdown crying. She pulled her knees to her chest and rocked back and forth. I knelt beside her, more confused than angry now. "Laura, what funeral? I need you to explain right now." I tried to keep my voice calm. She looked up with eyes so full of pain, I almost forgot she'd been sleeping with my brother. Through hiccuping sobs, she told me about the Facebook message. An anonymous account had messaged her saying I'd been killed in action. IED on patrol. "I called your unit, and they said you were on a classified mission. They couldn't confirm or deny anything." She wiped her nose on her sleeve. "Then your dad got the same message. Your mom did too. Then Drew. Everyone." My hands started shaking. Someone had told my entire family I was dead, while I was alive on base doing intel work. Safe behind walls while they planned my funeral and buried an empty casket with my name on it. "I need to see the message. Now." I helped her stand. She pulled up Facebook on her phone, scrolled back months to a message request. Anonymous account with no profile picture. But the message had details. My unit number, the patrol route we used, the type of IED common in that area. Things that weren't public knowledge. We held the service 2 weeks after the message. Full military honors. The base sent a folded flag. Laura showed me photos from the funeral I'd apparently missed. My parents crying over a casket, Drew giving a eulogy, Laura in a black dress accepting condolences, my high school friends as pallbearers, an entire funeral for someone who wasn't dead, who was doing classified intelligence work and couldn't contact home for months at a time. "When did you and Drew—" I couldn't finish the question. 2 months after the funeral. We were both grieving. It just happened. Fresh tears started. He was there every day, helping with arrangements, dealing with your things. We thought you were gone. I stared at the anonymous message again. Something familiar about the writing style. The way they structured sentences. Military precision but trying to sound civilian. Then I saw it. A phrase I'd heard 100 times. "Ultimate sacrifice for freedom," General Hampton's favorite saying. Oh God, I stood up so fast I knocked over a chair. General Hampton, Laura's father. My commanding officer who'd requested I extend my deployment. Who'd insisted I was too valuable for intel to come home on schedule. Who'd made veiled threats about court-martial when I'd pushed back. "What? What is it?" Laura struggled to her feet. I showed her the phrase. I watched recognition dawn on her face. Her father had very specific ways of speaking. Patterns we both knew from years of family dinners and military events. The anonymous message was full of them once you knew to look. "My dad told everyone you were dead?" She grabbed the counter for support. But I was already thinking bigger. General Hampton hadn't just wanted me to stay deployed. He'd manufactured my death to make it happen, traumatized my family, destroyed my marriage, pushed Laura into my brother's arms, all to keep me in Afghanistan running intelligence operations. He knew I'd never abandon you if I thought you were waiting, so he made sure you wouldn't be. The pieces clicked together. My phone started ringing. Drew calling back, then my parents, then numbers I didn't recognize. Word was spreading that I wasn't actually dead, that someone had orchestrated an elaborate lie that destroyed multiple lives. Laura looked at me and asked, "What do we do now?" I picked up my keys and headed for the door. General Hampton had some explaining to do, about fake deaths and real funerals, about playing God with people's lives for military convenience. But first I had one more call to make, to the Inspector General's office. Because faking a soldier's death had to be about a dozen different crimes, and I was about to make sure General Hampton answered for every single one. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I opened it as Laura watched over my shoulder. "Welcome home, son. We need to talk before you do anything rash. Your country needed you." I stared at Hampton's text for about 10 seconds before taking a screenshot with my phone. My hands moved on their own, forwarding the image to my personal email while Laura watched me work. She asked what we should do now, and I told her we were documenting everything starting right now, no exceptions. I grabbed her phone from the counter and started taking photos of the anonymous Facebook message with my phone, making sure to capture every word of the thread and the timestamp showing when it was sent. I told Laura not to delete anything from her phone and to change all her passwords immediately since her father might have access to her accounts. She nodded and started typing on her laptop while I kept photographing evidence. The Inspector General hotline number was saved in my contacts from mandatory briefings, and I hit call while Laura listened from across the kitchen. The intake officer answered after 2 rings, and I reported potential fraud, abuse of authority, and falsification of military records by a general officer. She took down the basics and gave me a case number starting with IG 2024 that I wrote on a napkin, then scheduled an appointment for tomorrow morning at 0900 hours. I hung up and immediately called the JAG office on base to get legal advice before I said anything that might violate classification rules. They scheduled me for that afternoon at 1400 hours with someone named Raymond Holloway who handled whistleblower cases. Laura was still changing passwords on every account she could think of while I started creating a secure cloud folder on my laptop. I uploaded the screenshot of Hampton's text first, then the photos of the Facebook message. Then Laura helped by finding email exchanges with her father from around the time of my supposed death. She had dozens of messages where he kept pushing her to accept my death and move forward with her life. The funeral photos went into the folder next, showing my parents crying over an empty casket while Hampton stood in his dress uniform looking solemn. The folded flag presentation letter from the base went in too, signed by someone I'd never heard of but using official letterhead. My phone started buzzing with calls from my parents, but I let them go to voicemail while I kept uploading evidence. After the 5th call, I finally answered and told them yes, I was alive, but couldn't explain everything yet because of an ongoing investigation. My mother was crying and asking how this was possible, and I said we'd meet tomorrow after my appointment with the Inspector General. Drew's texts started flooding my phone around the same time, 20 messages in 10 minutes asking if this was real and saying he was sorry and confused. I sent him one message back saying any communication needed to wait until after the investigation started because I needed to preserve evidence integrity. He kept texting, but I muted the conversation and went back to documenting everything. Hampton's text thread got saved to the cloud folder without me responding to him. Then I checked my phone settings to make sure location services were turned on in case he tried anything suspicious. That line about my country needing me made my skin crawl every time I looked at it. The JAG meeting that afternoon went exactly as expected, with Holloway explaining my whistleblower protections under federal law and agreeing to represent me through the investigation process. He reviewed my evidence folder and said I'd done everything right so far by not confronting Hampton directly. Back home that evening, Laura and I worked together adding more documents to the cloud folder, including her bank statements from after the funeral showing deposits from her father. She found old speeches he'd given at military events that we could compare to the anonymous message later. My parents called 3 more times before I answered again, and we agreed to meet at their house tomorrow afternoon after my morning appointment. The calls from numbers I didn't recognize kept coming, but I let them all go to voicemail since I didn't know who might be calling on Hampton's behalf. Late that night, while Laura slept on the couch, I sat at the kitchen table comparing phrases from the anonymous Facebook message to Hampton's old emails and speeches she had saved. The writing patterns matched perfectly with the same comma usage after introductory phrases, the same military terminology like ultimate sacrifice and duty before self, even his favorite patriotic phrases about freedom and service. I highlighted every matching phrase with a yellow marker on printed copies, creating a clear pattern that would be obvious to any investigator. The folder of evidence grew to over 50 files, including screenshots, photos, documents, and comparison sheets showing the writing analysis. My phone buzzed again at 6 a.m. the next morning with Hampton calling directly, but I declined the call and let it go to voicemail per Holloway's advice from yesterday. His message came through a minute later saying we should handle this situation as family and work things out privately without involving outside parties. The condescending tone in his voice when he said family almost made me throw my phone across the room, but I saved the voicemail to the cloud folder instead. Laura woke up and made coffee while I reviewed everything one more time before my appointment, making sure every piece of evidence was backed up in multiple places and organized clearly for the investigator. The drive to the IG office took 20 minutes through morning traffic, and I parked in the visitor lot near the main entrance. Inside the building, I signed in at the desk and waited in hard plastic chairs until a woman in her 40s with short gray hair called my name. Alicia Carr had sharp eyes behind wire glasses, and she led me to a small conference room with a recorder on the table. She turned on the device and had me state my name and swear to tell the truth before sliding my folder of evidence across the table. For the next hour, she went through every document asking questions about dates and times while taking notes on a yellow pad. She kept coming back to the timeline of the fake death message and when the funeral happened compared to my actual deployment schedule. Her pen moved fast across the paper when I showed her the comparison between Hampton's writing and the anonymous message. She made copies of everything and gave me a receipt with a case number before saying she'd be in touch soon. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual, and I found them waiting on the front porch with coffee already made. My dad's hands shook when he poured the cups, and my mom kept touching my arm like she needed to make sure I was real. I explained about Hampton faking my death to keep me deployed, and watched their faces go from confused to shocked to angry. My dad slammed his fist on the kitchen table so hard the coffee cups jumped, and my mom started crying angry tears. She went to the hall closet and pulled out a white memory box with my name written on the side in black marker. Her hands trembled as she opened it and pulled out the funeral program with my picture on the front and the date of my supposed death. The condolence cards were rubber banded together, and she spread them on the table, showing me messages from family friends and distant relatives. Several cards quoted phrases I recognized as Hampton's favorite sayings about sacrifice and duty to country that he used in every speech. My mom had saved everything, including the guest book from the service and photos people had sent of the ceremony. The next morning, I drove to Riverside Funeral Home with a notarized letter from my lawyer requesting all records related to my service. The director's face went white when he saw me standing at his desk alive and breathing after handling my funeral 6 months ago. He immediately pulled up the computer files and printed everything, including invoices showing payment from something called the Military Family Support Fund. The payment was for the full service package, including the casket rental and the reception hall, and came through 3 days after the fake death message. I spent the rest of that day at the base library researching the support fund on government websites and found it was a real organization. The payment record showed an authorization signature from Hampton's deputy, but the timestamp was 2:47 a.m. on a Saturday, which made no sense. Normal fund disbursements happen during business hours with multiple approvals, but mine went through the emergency authorization process reserved for combat zones. That evening, I texted Drew asking for his eulogy notes and any messages about the funeral without explaining why I needed them. His response came back in less than a minute with photo attachments of his handwritten speech and screenshots of text messages from those weeks. He asked if I was okay, and I just typed back thanks without answering his real question about what was happening. 2 days later, Alicia called while I was eating breakfast to say her team had pulled my official personnel file from records. The deployment extension paperwork had problems, including missing signatures from required approval authorities and dates that didn't match standard procedures. She said the forms looked rushed, and several mandatory review steps had been skipped, which violated regulations for extending deployments. That afternoon, Raymond called to say he'd gotten a copy of the casualty report that should have been filed for my death. The document existed in the system, but had major problems, including the wrong unit number and listing my deployment location incorrectly. The form said I died in Helmand Province, but my unit was stationed in Kandahar, which was hundreds of miles away. He said no competent officer would make those mistakes unless they were creating fake paperwork without access to real deployment data. 3 days after that, Hampton finally responded through official military channels with a statement his lawyer had clearly written. The response claimed everything was within his command authority due to operational security requirements and classification levels. He avoided any specific explanations and kept referencing the need to protect ongoing operations and intelligence sources without saying what those were. The statement was full of legal language about his responsibilities as a commander and the difficult decisions required in combat theaters. The next morning, I got a call from the base commander's office requesting I report immediately for a meeting about my duty status. The commander sat behind his desk looking uncomfortable and explained I would be on limited duty to avoid any appearance of retaliation. Raymond negotiated that I would work in the base legal office where he could monitor any attempts to interfere with the investigation. The commander agreed and signed the paperwork, reassigning me effective immediately with full pay and benefits maintained during the investigation period. Raymond pulled me into his office that afternoon with a thick folder of state laws about recording conversations. He spread out the papers showing our state was single-party consent, which meant I could record any conversation I was part of without telling the other person. We spent 2 hours going over the exact procedures for legal recordings, including keeping original files untouched and making backup copies immediately. He gave me a small digital recorder that time-stamped everything automatically and showed me how to transfer files to a secure cloud storage he'd set up. The next morning, the pastor from my funeral called saying he had something I needed to hear. I drove to his church where he played an audio recording he'd made of my entire service on his phone. My stomach turned hearing him talk about my sacrifice in Afghanistan and mentioning specific operations that were still classified. He described a mission in detail that only 3 people knew about, including Hampton, who'd been briefed on it personally. The pastor said Hampton had given him those details for the eulogy, saying the family deserved to know what a hero I'd been. I asked for a copy of the recording and he emailed it to me right there while I watched him send it. That same afternoon, Alicia called Laura asking if she'd consent to an interview about the whole situation. Laura agreed immediately and met with her at the base legal office where I wasn't allowed to be present. Alicia recorded the whole thing, and Laura handed over her phone with text messages from her dad during the funeral time. The messages showed Hampton telling her she needed to move forward with her life and find someone to lean on for support. One text from just 3 weeks after my funeral said she shouldn't feel guilty about finding comfort wherever she could. Another message encouraged her to let Drew help her through the grief, since family supporting family was natural. Laura also gave Alicia screenshots of emails where Hampton kept pushing her to accept that I was gone and start healing. Daniel Ortega called me the next day, saying he'd tracked the anonymous Facebook account through digital forensics. The IP address traced back to a computer on base in the command building where Hampton's office was located. Every single login to that account happened after normal duty hours between 7 and 10 at night. The metadata showed the account was created just 2 days before the death message was sent to my family. Daniel said the precision of the timing and location made it almost impossible for anyone except Hampton to have sent those messages. I met with Judith Holloway at the Casualty Assistance Office, where she swore she'd never processed any death notification for me. She pulled up the system on her computer, showing me exactly what forms should have been filed for a real casualty. The notification forms required multiple signatures and verification steps that simply didn't exist for my case. She showed me her logbook where every death notification was recorded by hand as a backup to the computer system. My name appeared nowhere in any of her records from that entire year. She said someone had completely bypassed the normal channels, which should have been impossible without her office's involvement. The base supply sergeant confirmed the next piece when I visited his warehouse with Raymond present. He pulled up records showing a folded flag was issued using Hampton's personal command authorization code. The normal process required forms from casualty assistance, but this one went through an emergency override only commanders could use. The timestamp showed it was processed at 11:30 at night, which made no sense for a standard requisition. He printed out the record showing Hampton's digital signature, authorizing the flag for my funeral service. My phone started buzzing with messages from guys in my unit who'd heard I was back and alive. 3 of them called within an hour saying they remembered when Laura had called the unit trying to verify my death. They'd been told I was on a classified mission and ordered not to discuss anything about my status with anyone. The duty officer had specifically said any questions about me should be referred to Hampton's office directly. One guy said he thought it was weird at the time, but figured it was just standard operational security stuff. Another said Hampton had personally briefed them about not confirming or denying anything related to my deployment status. Drew texted asking if we could meet, and I agreed, but only with Raymond present at a coffee shop off base. Drew showed up looking terrible with bags under his eyes and his hands shaking when he picked up his cup. He told us Hampton had basically lived at the house for weeks after the funeral, constantly talking about moving forward. Every conversation somehow turned to Laura needing support and not being alone during such a hard time. Drew said Hampton kept mentioning how important it was for family to take care of each other in times of loss. He admitted now that Hampton had been pushing them together, but at the time it felt like natural grief support. The next morning, Alicia's team found base security footage that changed everything about the case. The cameras showed Hampton entering the command building at the exact times the Facebook account was active. One video showed him badging in at 7:15, and the account logged in at 7:22 that same night. Another night he entered at 8:40, and the account became active at 8:47. The correlation was perfect for every single login over the 2-week period when the messages were sent. A journalist from the local paper called my cell asking for a comment about the investigation. I immediately handed the phone to Raymond, who told the reporter we couldn't discuss an ongoing investigation. The reporter said other sources were already talking, and the story would run with or without our input. Raymond negotiated a delay, asking them to hold the story until the investigation reached certain milestones. The reporter agreed but warned us that other outlets were sniffing around and wouldn't wait as long. 2 days later, Raymond called me at work saying Hampton's lawyer wanted to meet about a possible resolution to avoid any messy legal proceedings. I drove to Raymond's office where he played the voicemail on speaker, some guy with a smooth voice talking about operational security misunderstandings and how we could handle this quietly between professionals. Raymond picked up his desk phone and called the lawyer back while I listened, telling him to expect federal charges for fraud, false statements, and abuse of authority. The lawyer started talking about national security considerations, but Raymond cut him off saying the evidence was already with the DOJ and hung up. That same afternoon, Laura texted asking if I could come by the house because she'd found something on her old tablet she thought I should see. I met her in the kitchen where she had the tablet open to text messages between her and her father from right after the funeral. The messages showed Hampton telling her things like she needed to accept reality and move forward with life, that holding on to false hope wasn't healthy, that she was young and deserved happiness. One text from 3 weeks after my funeral said she shouldn't feel guilty about finding comfort with family during such a hard time. Another said Drew was a good man who could provide the stability she needed. I took photos of every message with my phone while Laura sat there crying again. The next few nights I couldn't sleep at all, just laying there staring at the ceiling thinking about everything Hampton had done. My hands would start shaking randomly during the day, and I'd have to leave meetings to calm down in the bathroom. After the third night without sleep, I called the VA crisis line at 4 a.m. and talked to someone for an hour about what was happening. They got me an appointment with a counselor for the next day, which I took even though it meant missing a meeting with Alicia. The counselor was this older guy who'd been in Vietnam and understood military stuff without me having to explain everything. He taught me this thing where I separate the investigation work from processing the betrayal, basically putting the emotional stuff in a box to deal with later, while I focused on the legal tasks. We practiced breathing exercises, and he gave me techniques for when my mind started racing at night. 3 days after that session, Alicia called saying she was interviewing Hampton under oath that afternoon and asked if I wanted to watch through the one-way glass. I sat in the observation room while Hampton walked in, wearing his dress uniform with all his ribbons like he was getting a medal instead of being questioned about crimes. He sat down and immediately started talking about mission success rates and operational necessities before Alicia even asked her first question. When she asked about the fake death notification, he called it operational latitude in handling family communications during sensitive deployments. He actually used the phrase acceptable losses when talking about the emotional damage to my family. Alicia asked him directly if he sent the Facebook messages, and he said he took actions necessary to ensure mission continuity. She asked if he knew I was alive when he authorized my funeral, and he said classification levels prevented him from confirming or denying personnel status to unauthorized individuals. His arrogance was incredible, acting like traumatizing my entire family was just another tactical decision. The next morning, Daniel from Digital Forensics called me over to look at something they'd found on Hampton's computer. He showed me a spreadsheet titled Personnel Retention Leverage Points, with dozens of soldier names listed. My name had notes about family ties being a deployment liability and how my connection to Laura created unacceptable mission risk. Other soldiers had similar notes about wives, kids, sick parents, anything that might make them want to come home. The spreadsheet had action items next to some names with things like increase deployment incentives and apply command pressure. Mine said implement contingency protocol 7, which nobody could figure out what that meant yet. Laura came by the legal office that afternoon with a box of bank statements and receipts. She showed me how her father had paid for her therapy sessions after the funeral, covered 3 months of mortgage payments, and even paid for groceries and utilities. She'd thought he was being a caring father, but now realized it was guilt money, or maybe keeping her dependent on him. The receipts showed he used something called a morale and welfare fund, which was supposed to help military families in crisis. She'd kept everything because she wanted to pay him back someday. but now it was evidence. The forensic accountant on Alicia's team traced those payments back through the system and found Hampton had complete control over this fund with almost no oversight. The fund was real and legitimate, but using it to support a fake widow violated about 15 different regulations. He'd withdrawn cash for the funeral home payment to avoid leaving a direct trail, but the timing and amounts matched perfectly. Raymond spent 2 full days going through all our evidence, making sure nothing classified was included before it went into the legal record. He had me sit with him marking out unit names, operation codes, and anything that might compromise real missions. We could prove Hampton faked my death without revealing any actual intelligence operations, which was important for the prosecution. While we worked, Hampton kept texting my phone trying to appeal to my sense of duty and patriotism. I didn't even read them anymore, just screenshotted and forwarded everything straight to Alicia. Each message he sent added to the obstruction charges since he'd been ordered not to contact me directly. 3 days later, Raymond called me at home to warn me about something coming. A reporter from the base newspaper had been asking questions about unusual casualty notifications, and the public affairs office was preparing a response. Sure enough, that afternoon, an article appeared online talking about irregularities in death notification procedures, without naming anyone specific, but the details made it obvious they meant my case. The article mentioned an ongoing investigation into whether proper protocols were followed when notifying families of combat losses. Within hours, the base Facebook page had hundreds of comments demanding answers about who faked a soldier's death. The Public Affairs Office released a statement saying they were cooperating fully with investigators and took all allegations seriously, but couldn't comment on ongoing cases. By evening, other news sites had picked up the story, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts from people who'd figured out it was about me. The next morning, things got worse when I checked social media and found posts suggesting I'd gone AWOL and made up the whole story to avoid punishment. Someone claiming to be a former unit member said I'd been a problem soldier who couldn't handle deployment stress. Another anonymous account posted that I was lying about the fake death to get attention and sympathy. The comments under these posts were brutal, calling me everything from a coward to a traitor. Raymond screenshot everything and said these were clearly coordinated attacks from Hampton's supporters trying to muddy the waters before any charges were filed. He started documenting all the defamation for potential civil action later. That same day, Alicia called with good news that the Inspector General had officially filed whistleblower protection paperwork on my behalf. This meant the Army couldn't take any adverse action against my career during the investigation, including transfers, deployments, or administrative punishment. The protection extended until the case was completely resolved, which could take months or even years. I tried to go back to normal duties at the legal office, but found myself locked out of several computer systems. My access to personnel records was suspended, and I couldn't even log into the training database. When I asked about it, the IT department said my accounts were frozen pending the investigation outcome. Raymond explained this was actually protecting the case integrity by preventing anyone from claiming I'd accessed or altered evidence. The isolation was frustrating, though, sitting at a desk doing basic filing while my whole career hung in the balance. To keep myself busy, I started studying the Army's casualty assistance regulations on my personal laptop. The manual was hundreds of pages long, but I read every single one, taking notes on each violation Hampton had committed. There were specific procedures for death notifications, including who could authorize them, what documentation was required, and how families had to be contacted. Hampton had broken at least 40 different regulations just in the notification process alone. Then there were the fraud violations for using government funds for a fake funeral, the false official statements, and abuse of his command authority. The more I studied, the more I realized how many laws he'd broken to keep me deployed. My phone buzzed with a text from Drew that stopped me cold. He wrote that he was sorry for everything and should have questioned the circumstances more. He admitted Hampton had been at their house constantly after the funeral, always talking about how Laura needed support and family around her. Drew said he realized now that Hampton had been pushing them together the whole time, but grief had clouded his judgment. He ended by saying he knew apologizing wouldn't fix anything, but wanted me to know he'd been manipulated too. I didn't respond, but forwarded the message to Alicia as potential evidence. 2 days later, Alicia called to say Drew had contacted her directly wanting to provide a statement. He met with her team and described how Hampton had given him specific scripts about what to say to Laura, phrases about moving forward and not dwelling on the past. Drew showed them text messages where Hampton coached him on being there for Laura and making sure she wasn't alone. His testimony confirmed the pattern of manipulation Alicia had been building in her case. The investigation took a major turn when Daniel called me excited about something his team had found. They'd gotten a warrant for Hampton's government emails and discovered drafts that matched phrases from the anonymous Facebook message exactly. The metadata showed he'd composed these drafts on his office computer after normal duty hours, probably thinking he was being careful. But the phrases were identical to what appeared in the death notification, including specific military terminology and his favorite patriotic expressions. Even better, the email system had tracked that he'd accessed maps of patrol routes and IED incident reports right before drafting the message. This was the smoking gun proving he'd personally created the fake death notification. Raymond called me into his office the next morning with news that changed everything. The Department of Justice had reviewed the evidence and decided to take the case for federal prosecution. Hampton would face charges for fraud against the United States, making false official statements and criminal abuse of his authority as a general officer. The potential sentences added up to decades in federal prison, plus massive fines. Raymond said the prosecutors were confident they had enough evidence for conviction, but wanted one more piece to seal the case completely. That's when Laura agreed to do something I never expected. The prosecutors asked if she'd be willing to meet with her father while wearing a wire to get him talking about why he'd done it. Laura struggled with the decision for days, torn between getting justice and betraying her father, but finally agreed it was the only way to get the truth. The meeting was set for a coffee shop off base where Hampton thought they'd have privacy. I waited in a van outside with the prosecutors listening to every word through Laura's hidden microphone. Hampton started carefully, talking about duty and sacrifice, but Laura pushed him about destroying our marriage. Finally, after 20 minutes of dancing around it, he said the words that confirmed everything. He told her he knew I'd never leave the mission if I thought she was waiting for me back home, so he had to make sure she moved on with her life. He actually said he did it for my own good, that I was too valuable in Afghanistan to waste my talents coming home to play house. His exact words were that love was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford during wartime, and he'd freed me from that burden by eliminating what was holding me back. The prosecutors in the van looked at each other knowing they had him cold. 3 weeks later, Alicia walked into Raymond's office while I was reviewing documents and dropped a thick folder on his desk. The Inspector General's interim report was done, and Hampton was suspended from command immediately while criminal charges moved forward. The report found systematic failures in casualty notification procedures across the entire base command structure. They ordered a complete audit of every death notification from the past 5 years to check for similar problems. Raymond read through the key findings while I sat there feeling both vindicated and exhausted from everything that had happened. That night, Laura and I sat at our kitchen table with boxes of our things scattered around us. We'd been sleeping in separate rooms for weeks already, but now it was time to make it official. She signed the separation agreement our lawyers had drawn up while tears ran down her face. Neither of us wanted divorce yet, but we both needed space to figure out if our marriage could survive what her father had done to us. The next morning, I met with the family attorney alone to go over the details of protecting our assets during the criminal proceedings. We agreed not to make any public statements that could affect the case against Hampton. The lawyer made copies of everything and filed the paperwork with the county clerk that afternoon. 2 days later, the Department of Justice prosecutor called Raymond to say the grand jury had voted to indict Hampton on federal charges. The evidence was so overwhelming they expected him to take a plea deal rather than risk trial. Hampton was facing fraud against the United States, making false official statements and criminal abuse of his position as a general officer. The potential sentences added up to decades in federal prison. Base Public Affairs issued a carefully worded statement about procedural failures in casualty notification without admitting the full scope of what Hampton had done. The language frustrated me, but Raymond explained this was typical military damage control. They'd never admit more than absolutely necessary to avoid additional liability. Casualty Affairs contacted my parents offering to correct all official records and provide proper documentation that I was alive. My mother told them to keep the folded flag they'd been given at my funeral as a reminder of what military families go through. She hung it in their living room with a note underneath about the price of blind trust in authority. The following week, I spent 5 hours in a secure facility providing sworn testimony to the DOJ prosecutors. I detailed every aspect of the deception within classification boundaries, showing them my documentation and timeline. The prosecutor said my evidence made their case airtight and thanked me for being so thorough in documenting everything from the beginning. Drew submitted his own written statement to the prosecutors through his lawyer confirming Hampton's manipulation after my supposed death. He described how Hampton was at Laura's house constantly, always steering conversations toward her needing to move on with her life. Drew didn't ask for my forgiveness in the statement, but acknowledged the damage his actions had caused our family. He accepted responsibility for his choices, while making it clear Hampton had orchestrated the entire situation. Laura and I met one last time at the house to divide up the rest of our property without lawyers present. We sorted through wedding photos and deployment letters in silence, both of us recognizing we were victims of her father's manipulation in different ways. She took the china her grandmother had given us, and I kept the tools my dad had passed down to me. We split the furniture based on who had space for what in our new living situations. Neither of us mentioned the future or whether we'd try to reconcile after everything settled. We just focused on the practical tasks of separating two lives that had been twisted apart by lies. The journalist who'd been following the story finally published their investigation with all the documentation we'd provided. Congressional oversight committees immediately demanded hearings about military casualty notification procedures. The story went national overnight with every major news outlet picking it up. My phone rang nonstop with interview requests that I forwarded to Raymond. He fielded the calls and explained we couldn't comment during ongoing criminal proceedings. The base commander called me personally the next day, offering a transfer to any installation I wanted to get away from the controversy. He said they'd expedite the paperwork and cover all moving expenses as an apology for what I'd been through. I accepted a position at a base near my parents, where I could rebuild my life away from the constant reminders of everything that had happened here. The paperwork went through faster than any military transfer I'd ever seen, and within 3 weeks I was packing up my apartment while movers loaded boxes into a truck. Hampton's lawyer called Raymond 2 days before I left to say they were taking the plea deal the prosecutors had offered. No prison time, but Hampton would lose his pension and be banned from any government job for life. Raymond said it was better than most cases got, but I still felt like he was getting off easy for destroying so many lives. The prosecutors explained that proving intent beyond reasonable doubt would be harder than we thought, so the plea was our best shot at any justice. I signed off on the victim impact statement they'd use at sentencing, and tried not to think about how light the punishment seemed. Hampton released a statement through his lawyer about his, quote, overzealous dedication to mission success, unquote, that made my blood boil. No direct apology, and no admission that what he did was wrong, just some garbage about serving his country with too much passion. My dad called it typical officer covering his ass while my mom wanted him in prison, but we all knew this was the best we'd get. The base commander asked me to come to his office my last day on base for what he called an unofficial meeting. He closed the door and told me the military had failed to protect me from abuse of power, and he was personally sorry for what I'd gone through. Off the record, he said, but he wanted me to know the institution recognized its failure, even if they couldn't say it publicly. I appreciated the gesture, even though it didn't fix anything. My parents had kept the folded flag from my fake funeral in their living room like some kind of shrine, so I wrote them a long letter explaining everything and drove it over with a box to put the flag in. They read it together on the couch while I sat in Dad's recliner, watching their faces change from confusion to understanding to anger and back again. Mom said they'd keep displaying it with a note she wrote about how truth was the highest form of honor, and Dad nodded like that settled something important. Drew texted asking if we could talk before I left town, and I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. We sat at a corner table and worked out how we'd handle family events going forward, since avoiding each other forever wasn't realistic with our parents getting older. We'd be polite at holidays and birthdays, but the brotherhood we'd had since we were kids were gone, and we both knew it. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it because some things can't be fixed with words. Laura and I met at the lawyer's office to sign separation papers, making everything official and dividing up the last of our shared accounts. We agreed to stay respectful at any family gatherings, and both started seeing therapists separately to work through everything before making final divorce decisions. She looked smaller somehow sitting across that conference table signing papers, and I realized we were both victims of her father's manipulation in different ways. The drive to my new base took 2 days, and I spent most of it thinking about how different everything would be starting over in a new place. Setting up my new apartment near my parents felt strange after years of military housing, but having them close by helped more than I expected. The new unit didn't know my whole story, which was exactly what I needed to focus on work without constant reminders. Therapy at the VA started slow, but after a few months I could talk about everything without my hands shaking or my chest getting tight. 9 months after that nightmare homecoming, I was running intel briefs at my new assignment and building something like a normal life. The justice wasn't perfect since Hampton avoided prison, but at least the truth was public, and he faced real consequences for playing God with people's lives. Some nights I still woke up angry about everything stolen from me, but most days I focused on moving forward because living well was the only revenge that actually mattered. My therapist said healing wasn't linear, and some days would be harder than others, but I was making progress. The story had made national news and prompted new oversight rules for casualty notifications, though that felt like closing the barn door after the horses were gone. I kept all the documentation in a filing cabinet, partly for any future legal needs, but mostly as proof that it really happened when sometimes it felt too crazy to be real. And that's how it went down. Thanks for tagging along with me. We'll do it again whenever you're back.